Hi, and welcome to Global Studies with Miss Pritchard. This video is for Global 1 students. It will cover the early empires in the Middle East and China, and it goes with Chapter 4. Now, I strongly encourage you to listen to the video once and then play it through a second time, pausing it to copy the notes. That is how the information is going to stick in your brain the most. But since a lot of you are probably listening to music and not listening to me, you're not going to know that. So to those of you who are listening to me, yay! You're doing this right. All right, the Egyptian Empire. The New Kingdom of Egypt began around 1600 BC when the Egyptians began to drive out the Hyksos. They were the ones that came in with chariots and conquered the Middle Kingdom. So the New Kingdom came up after that. Some of the notable Egyptian rulers from this time is Queen Chap. She ruled after her husband died in battle, and she continued to rule until her second son took the throne. And then while he was off fighting wars, she actually stopped a couple of plans to assassinate him. So she's pretty notable that way. Probably one of the most famous ones is Queen Hatshepsut, and she ruled as a pharaoh. There were multiple monuments and statues and temples that actually show her in the full costume of the king, including the fake beard and the scepter and the whole deal. Those were established during her rule. She ruled for over 20 years, and they are destroyed when her stepson and nephew, yeah, think about that. He was a stepson and a nephew. It's kind of creepy and gross, but that's the way they ruled in ancient Egypt. Anyways, it was Thutmose III. He waited over 20 years to rule, and then once he did become pharaoh, he ended up expanding the empire. He built many temples and monuments, and ruled during a pretty successful and prosperous time in Egypt. And the most famous of all of the pharaohs, other than King Tut, is Ramses II. And he is one of the longest ruling pharaohs. He ruled for over 66 years. He died when he was over 90 years old. And this is the part that is truly astounding. He had over 100 children. He had over 90 sons and 60 daughters. So just think about that for a minute. 140 kids. Or 150. Depends on how you do the math and how many of them survive past their first birthday. The fact is, he outlived most of his children. Because, well, he lived until he was over 90, and most Egyptians, ancient Egyptians anyways, died by the time they were 40. So, Ramses II is known as Ramses the Great and the Great Ancestor. His mummy is on display in Cairo's Egyptian Museum. So, if you ever make it to Cairo, you can see his actual body. Other interesting fact, he was actually a redhead or a blonde. I don't know how many of you connect the image of the dark hair and dark eyes with Egypt, but he apparently was a redhead. All right, and the pharaohs built secret tombs in the valleys of the kings, and that is where we have found many of the mummies and the remains. However, we don't find complete tombs because, well, everybody knew they were there, and they would break in and steal all the stuff because it was gold and jewels and all of that. But some of them did survive. And as I mentioned before, King Tut is the most famous, and that is because his tomb was actually found completely intact, which is very, very rare. So that's your little bit about the Egyptian Empire. Nubian empires. There is the Kush Empire that rose to the south of Egypt, and it took on many of the Egyptian characteristics because, well, Egypt was one of the powers of the time. It is one of the oldest civilizations, and the Kush even ruled over Egypt for a time after they drove the Libyans out. So you can see Egypt is caught between a few different cultures and groups. And even though they have the desert to protect them, it is not a foolproof method. And as you can see, the Hyksos, the Libyans, the Cush, they all managed to conquer Egypt when it was weak. All right, the capital of Meroe was the center of the iron trade, and that is what gave the Cush Empire its wealth. The Assyrian Empire. They rose in Mesopotamia around 850 BC, and they were very, very warlike. And the reason for that is because they had no natural defenses. Remember, they're out in the middle of the desert, so they learned very early to fight to protect their homes. They end up conquering much of the Middle East, and unfortunately, they treat their conquered peoples very cruelly, which leads to their downfall because then all of the people who are conquered and are being treated horribly join together to defeat them. So, little lesson, if you take over an empire or you want to create an empire, be nice to the people and keep them happy, and they won't try to kill you and overthrow your empire. All right, the Persians. That began in what is present-day Iran around 550 BC. King Cyrus created the great empire, but he's not a cruel leader. He did not destroy cities or temples. He actually promoted religious toleration, which is what allows his empire to expand and last longer than the Assyrians. So there's that lesson again. If you treat people kindly and with tolerance, they will tolerate your rule a lot longer than if you don't. All right, King Darius rules during the Golden Age, and he expands the empire. And the key to the Persian control was the royal road, because that allowed communication and control. Because if you have people running back and forth to communicate with the empire and the capital, then you can also move your army to where it needs to be. So the royal road is a key. You have to have communication, and your army has to be able to move, and that's how you keep power. Zoroaster. He was a Persian prophet, and he started a monotheistic religion, and he believed that the world was a battleground between good and evil, and in the end, you would be judged on your actions and which side you supported or fought with. So, does that sound familiar to anyone? That, life is a choice between good and evil, and in the end, you either go to a great place because you fought for good, or you go to a bad place because you supported evil. I'll let you figure that one out. Although, if you write it on a Post-it note with your name and you give it to me, bonus points. China. The Zhou dynasty fell into decline, and China enters the period of what we call the Warring States. It's about 500 years when feudal warlords controlled China. A warlord is somebody who is rich and powerful and has their own army and attempts to conquer more and more land. One way you can connect that to the modern day is that there are parts of Africa that are currently controlled by warlords, especially in the nations of Somalia and other countries in the central part of Africa. If you have money, you can have an army. If you have an army, you can control an area. All right, so during this period of warring states in China, there are 3 different philosophies that developed, and one connection you might want to make here is that when there is a period of chaos or instability, that's when people become very spiritual, and you will see major religions and major philosophies or belief systems develop. That is because people are looking for answers. They don't want to live a horrible life, so they try to find a way to have hope and to explain all of the chaos that's going on. So, peace finally returns when Shi Huangdi becomes the first emperor of China. He is also known as Emperor Qin. That should sound familiar because that is where China gets its name from. And the Qin dynasty starts in 221 BC. He is the one who starts building the Great Wall of China, and that is to keep invaders out. And you might want to note that the Great Wall of China is one of the wonders of the world. It is one of the few man-made things that is visible from space, and we will be watching a video about it. Confucius. He is the most famous of the philosophies that comes out of the periods of the Warring States, and that is because most of Chinese civilization after his life is based on his beliefs. And even today, the Chinese culture is based on his ideas of filial piety. That is devotion to the family. And he said everything is based on 5 relationships. And within those relationships, there's somebody who's in charge and somebody who has to follow directions, except for the last one, which is the only equal relationship. And that is friend to friend. But the other 4 are father to son, husband to wife, older to younger, and emperor to subject. In all of those cases, the first one is the one with the power, and the second one is the one that has to follow. So if you look at that, please note that it's all men who have the power, and that mothers were even submissive to their sons. So that is what we call a patriarchy, and that is a word you definitely want to connect with China. The men had all of the power. Anyways, if you follow these rules with the relationships, then there will be peace and social order. And as I mentioned before, it is the foundation of Chinese culture and government even to this day. All right, the other philosophies that developed were Taoists, and those were people who believed you should live in harmony with nature and you should seek balance. And the very famous symbol for that is the yin-yang symbol. You've probably seen it. It's a circle that is divided between white and black, and in the white side there's a black dot, and in the black side there's a white dot. That is representing balance. It's balance between light and dark, feminine and masculine, and all of those things. I would say good and evil, but that's pretty simplistic. All right, the other philosophy, and this is the one that Emperor Qin adopted, and you'll see why, because it really made it easy for him to rule, is the legalists or legalism. And that is the belief that strict rules and harsh punishments from a strong leader will keep order. Now, if you've paid attention throughout these notes, you know that those strict rules and harsh punishments will work for a short time, but ultimately, people don't like being held down and abused, so they will revolt. And that is one reason that the Qin dynasty does not last very long. Although Emperor Qin does start the Great Wall of China, and he has a massive and magnificent tomb that was found in the 1970s, when a farmer fell through part of his field and found some terracotta soldiers. They thought there were a few hundred of them. Turns out there's a few thousand of those terracotta soldiers, and each one is modeled on an individual from Emperor Qin's army. So another opportunity for bonus points for you is to research the terracotta army and Emperor Qin's tomb. Now, I will tell you, there's not a whole lot about Emperor Qin's tomb because they're really afraid to open it because he did booby trap it. And the Chinese refused to let any foreigners help them excavate it because, you know, it's a whole symbol of their independence and their history and everything else. All right, so what you should do now is copy down the notes and make sure you show them to me for credit.